So we're going to talk about invasive species as well as endangered species. So we are going to jump right in here. Maybe. Really, maybe. There it is. Okay. And we're going to start by talking about invasive species. So what is an invasive species? Well, an invasive species is a species that is not native to an area. It is usually introduced to that area through transportation by humans. That may be intentional. More often it is unintentional. So here's an example. You see this boat propeller, and it's totally encrusted with zebra mussels. And zebra mussels are an invasive species that were introduced by being transported in the ballast water of ships. And then when that ballast water was pumped out to change the weight of the boat, then the zebra mussels were introduced into new areas. One of the things that makes invasive species so dangerous is that they don't have any natural predators. And so their populations can explode very quickly because there's nothing in that area that eats that species. They tend to be highly competitive. They might be fast reproducers, they might be aggressive feeders, or they might be fast growers, but they tend to be very aggressive in their competition for resources. And that allows them to thrive in their non-native habitats. So here's a classic example of an invasive species. This is a python in Florida, and pythons in Florida were generally introduced through the pet trade, and they have decimated the large mammal population of Florida. And here's another image of a python eating a deer. Very often invasive species are selected species. They also tend to be generalists because they, as our selected species, have that high biotic potential. They have low levels of parental care. And so you can have a very large population in a short amount of time. And as generalists, they're highly adaptable to the different environments, and may well be better equipped to deal with changes in their environment than the native species. Oh, and yeah, diverse food needs. Okay, so there are certain invasive species that it is helpful to know. There have been several instances on the exam where you've been asked to name an invasive species. Also, these are just great examples to have to refer back to. So we'll start with the zebra mussel. I touched on this already. It's called the zebra mussel because it has zebra-like stripes on its shell. This is a filter feeder. It was transported in ship ballast water. It eats algae and other plankton that lots of other species rely on. And because it is such an efficient filter feeder, it actually outcompetes the native species for food. Another thing that makes the zebra mussel so effective as an invasive species is that it can lay 1 million eggs per year, one zebra mussel. So that's a lot of little baby zebra mussels. And so zebra mussels have spread all over the East Coast and through the Great Lakes. They have not progressed farther west than the Rocky Mountains, and that's because they are transported through water systems and they can't get to the other side. And this is just an image of a pipe from Lake Mead, Nevada. This is not zebra mussels. This is a different kind of mussel. This is called a quagga mussel, but same idea. Zebra mussels will do the same thing. They will totally encrust water intake pipes for water treatment plants. They will totally encrust outgoing pipes from sewage treatment plants. So they can be exceptionally damaging to man-made structures as well as to other organisms. This is one you guys are probably familiar with. This is the kudzu vine, also known as the vine that ate the South. So kudzu was planted to try and limit soil erosion in the southern US. It was also thought that it would be a good food source for cows. It grows really, really rapidly. It's native to Japan. Unfortunately, in the US, it has no native predators. Nothing eats it. It outcompetes the natives for sunlight. It grows over them, as you can see in that image. And as you've seen, I'm sure, plenty of times on your drive to and from school, it will climb up and over entire trees. No herbivores in the US eat the kudzu vine, and so it has no natural predators. The cows that people thought would eat it have actually figured out very quickly that kudzu vine is also a great shelter for snakes, and so they won't go in it. Okay, Asian carp are another one of our aquatic invasive species. They were brought in originally to control algae growth in aquatic farms, but they escaped those aquatic farms into the Mississippi River. And once they're in the Mississippi River, they have access to many, many bodies of water in the United States. They tend to outcompete native fish for food and space. Asian carp are famous jumpers, and you will occasionally see videos on YouTube or TikTok that are Asian carp actually throwing themselves into the boats of fishermen. So they're kind of interesting to watch. Because they outcompete the native fish for food and space, and because people don't eat them, it does decrease the fishery production and value. One of the approaches to invasive species is to eat the invasive species. There are certainly some people who will eat Asian carp, but it is not commonly on American menus. And so one of the approaches that is being taken in areas where the Asian carp has become invasive is introducing recipes and ways of cooking it to try and use fishing for it and eating it as a way to control its population. The emerald ash borer is one of the invasive species we have here in Virginia. It was spread by wood packing materials in ships and planes. One of the common ways that it is spread here is through firewood. So this is why if you ever go camping, it says don't transport firewood, because you may unknowingly be transporting the emerald ash borer from an area where it is found to an area where it's not. The larvae are laid in the bark of the tree, and they eat their way through the bark and into the phloem, which prevents the tree from transporting nutrients, and it kills the tree. Their range is expanding because of global warming, so they are reaching farther and farther north. The cane toad is another sort of classic example of an invasive species. It was originally introduced in Australia to eat sugarcane beetles. It is native to Southeast Asia, but in Southeast Asia, it has predators. In Australia, it had no native predators, and it doesn't just eat the cane beetles. It became invasive because it has a huge appetite. It ate everything, and it drove declines in other amphibians and small reptiles because it was eating everything. Fun fact about the cane toads, they actually secrete a poison on the surface of their skin that can cause things that try to eat them to get sick, and in extreme cases even causes death in predators. So that's one of the reasons that nothing in Australia eats it. And we've already talked a little bit about the pythons in Florida, mostly introduced through the pet trade. People get tired of having a pet snake and they get rid of it by just leaving it in the wild. The environment in Florida is very hospitable to the python, and so they have reproduced. They are enormous. They have decimated mammal populations in the Everglades. They have no natural predators, and in fact, as you can see in this image, they will even eat crocodiles. So very aggressive. So how can we control these? Well, we need to control them. They're expensive. They're estimated to cost our economy $120 billion per year, and that was in 2005. It's even more now. And that's through lost agricultural productivity, lost tourism, decline in property values, decline in fisheries, and then, of course, the costs of controlling them and removing them. So, how do we control them and remove them? Well, we have laws that prevent transporting invasives. So, in the case of the emerald ash borer, it makes it illegal to transport firewood. Another way that we can help to control these is to remove the hosts to reduce spread. So for the emerald ash borer, any of the dead ash trees, we want to cut those down and take them away so that the larvae can't spread to other trees. And you've probably, again, if you've been camping in Virginia, you've seen signs like this. Things that are transported by boat. This is why it's really important to carefully clean and inspect boats, to pump out ballast water tanks, not allow them to. And then you'll also find a lot of lakes, especially in the Midwest, that will not allow boats from other areas unless they go through certain cleaning steps. A lot of the time, introducing a natural predator is one way of controlling invasive species. So in the case of the emerald ash borer, they're introducing Chinese wasps, which are the natural predator. There's always a concern when you introduce a natural predator that you are also introducing something that is non-native and which can become invasive itself. And so, like the case with the cane toads. So this is something that has to be done very carefully. This is something that they're also doing in the American Southeast with kudzu. There is a kudzu beetle that eats only kudzu, and so they're in the process of introducing that in some areas of the American South. And then, of course, there's always physical removal. So that would be hunting pythons. There's actually a season for this in Florida. Detaching those zebra mussels, pulling plants out, cutting trees down, trapping and killing insects when we can. Okay, so that's invasive species. Now let's talk about endangered species. So the invasives are the ones we don't want. The endangered species are very often the species that we do want, but because of threats to their environment, we'll talk about some of those as well, are in danger of disappearing entirely. Okay, so how do species become endangered? Well, one common way is through poaching. So that would be species like rhinoceros, elephants, certain tigers and leopards, where poachers hunt these species for their fur or their tusks or their horns. Some species are also over-harvested or over-hunted for food. And then lastly, they are removed from the wild and sold as pets or to organizations that are less than reputable, like, say, Tiger King. Species can also become endangered because they are specialists, because they have special food or habitat needs. So if you think about a koala, it only eats eucalyptus. So if it only eats eucalyptus and the area where it lives is becoming less hospitable to eucalyptus, or it has lost it all in wildfires or drought, then koalas are going to be endangered in that area because they can only eat that specific food. Because they tend to have these special food and habitat needs, endangered species are generally less tolerant of changing climates, habitat loss, wildfires, deforestation, habitat fragmentation. All of those pieces, as we've talked about before, tend to make specialists more prone to becoming endangered. Invasive species can also cause some species to become endangered. So if we go back to that zebra mussel, those invasives can outcompete the natives for resources, whether those resources are food or water or sun or space. So kudzu outcompetes for water and sun. Zebra mussels outcompete for food and space. Zebra mussels have endangered 30 native mussel species in US rivers simply by outcompeting. And then, of course, climate change contributes substantially to endangered species status. Again, those specialists that have to have a particular habitat are going to have a harder time finding that with climate change. In addition, habitats are fragmented or lost as a result of climate change, and so migration becomes very difficult. Species cannot adapt quickly enough, and so they may not have the opportunity to migrate because of fragmentation or habitat loss. They may not be able to migrate quickly enough, and they certainly cannot adapt quickly enough. So, how do we protect these endangered species? Well, one way that we can protect them is by preventing poaching, um, whether that's by hiring armed guards, as they frequently do in some areas of Africa and Asia. These are guards who are supposed to monitor populations and prevent poaching. You can create laws that punish poaching severely, whether that's fines or jail time. You also, as far as poaching prevention, there are laws in place to make it less valuable to sell the objects that are poached. So, like laws that prevent the selling of ivory objects help to prevent the poaching of elephant tusks. We can protect those wildlife habitats, whether we designate areas as parks or reserves or sanctuaries. We can prevent hunting, especially during certain seasons. Um, it's always difficult to balance the needs of humans and the needs of the environment. So, development is always a touchy subject when it comes to protecting the habitat of an animal or allowing the building of homes. This can always be an issue. Um, but smart development can help here, preventing fragmentation, preventing deforestation. And all of that allows these species space and time to breed and reestablish their population size. There are a number of success stories out there about endangered species that have recovered from the brink of extinction to only critically endangered or endangered based on the protection of their habitats. And then all of this kind of falls under legislation. So, CITES is the international agreement that countries set up agencies to monitor the import and export of endangered species. And those are the species that are listed on the red list, which is the endangered species list. That's the international agreement. In the US, we have the Endangered Species Act. This is the US law that gives the Fish and Wildlife Service the power to designate a species as endangered or threatened. And then within the US, not across US borders, but within the US, the Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for monitoring trade and for identifying and protecting those habitats. So this is the red list. The red list ranges from organisms of least concern at the low end to extinct at the highest end of the red list. So organisms of least concern or species of least concern are those abundant, widespread species. They are not currently threatened. Near threatened means that they're likely to wind up on the threatened list in the near future. On the threatened list, we have kind of three levels of threatened, and all three of those are at high risk of extinction in the near future. The CR is critically endangered, EN is endangered. And then beyond threatened, we have extinct in the wild, which means that the only organisms that we know of that species live in zoos or sanctuaries or reserves. And then, of course, the last step is when an animal actually becomes extinct. So when we look at categories, our most endangered category of organisms are amphibians. 41% of amphibians are endangered. And that's because they are especially vulnerable because they spend part of their life in the water, part of their life on land, and because they breathe through their skin, they have highly permeable skin, and so they're very prone to taking in toxins, and they're very susceptible to slight changes in their environment. 25% of mammals are endangered. 13% of birds, 33% of warm water corals, and that's because of that changing ocean temperature and pH. That's that ocean acidification and warming from those rising carbon dioxide levels. And then 34% of conifers, and that comes down to habitat change and global climate change. Most conifers require a lot of water and a relatively cool temperature. So they're threatened by warming temperatures, but they're also threatened by diseases and insects that are expanding their range because of those warming temperatures. Okay, specialists versus generalists, pandas or trash pandas. So specialists like pandas only eat one food. They can't adapt easily to new conditions. They can't move easily to a new habitat. And so when their habitat is rapidly changing, they are at a major disadvantage. Your generalists, your trash pandas, they're very likely to be able to move to a new habitat. They can adapt to new conditions, and they actually find rapidly changing habitat conditions advantageous. And so the generalists are much less likely to become endangered. Specialists are much more likely to become endangered. Generalists are much more likely to be invasive species. Specialists are much less likely to be invasive species. Specialists are most likely to become endangered or extinct. Generalists, least likely. Okay, one more thing about endangerment is competition. So here on the left, we have the Shenandoah salamander. This is a Virginia species. It is endangered. It lives only on 3 specific mountains because this guy on the right, the fiercely territorial red-backed salamander, actually guards rock habitats from other salamander species and prevents those salamanders from expanding their range. And so this is a way that competition, this would be an interspecific competition. So this is a competition between species. They're competing for resources, whether that's food, nesting sites, water. And this is one of the major reasons that this particular salamander is threatened, especially combined with habitat fragmentation or other loss of habitat. Okay, and that's it for tonight. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.